very pleased with this turnout. This is the biggest one we've had so far. I'm Jennifer Moss. I'm assistant curator here. Today we're going to have C is for Cherokee in our ABCs of Oconee series. Throughout the years, all of our programs will be related to alphabet. So check our Facebook, check our website, and if you want to be on our email list, please let me know so you can hear about the programs. Got a couple of programs coming up. Tomorrow night is our trivia night. Real fun night. If you don't have anything to do, it's $5 per team. We've also got our Stitching Together series on Saturday, which is you just come and bring your knitting or sewing or whatever you want to do, and we kind of have fun and learn at the same time. And also, just to let you know, we do need donations to keep programs like this going. So if you can spare $1 or $2, we have a donation jar in the back. We would appreciate it. But otherwise, here is Dr. Dave LaVere. Round of applause.
I'll put in an initial plug for something else too. Here's where we're going to talk about things that are coming up. If you have the brochure inside, there's a picture of a tree in there. It's a bent tree. Well, come to find out, there's been a lot of research now from Don Wells out of northern Georgia that a lot of these bent trees are actually, when you GPSed everything, located along the Cherokee trails. So he began to understand that these weren't usual trees, or these weren't just freak trees. Something was going on with these trees. So to make a long story short, after this investigation, talking to the Cherokee, etc., they realized that these were marker trees that were actually shaped by the Cherokee when they were saplings, tied them down, and sometimes there's so many different shapes and styles of these. And this caught fire here. We didn't know anything about trail trees 3 or 4 years ago, and he came up and we started looking along these trails, and he asked them the old timers, and etc., if they'd ever seen these trees. Oh yeah, I got 2 or 3 in my property, and we go see them. And it just became something that just kept rolling really quickly. So now we've located probably around 50 trees just in the upstate like this. And I talked with the Forest Service folks, and at one time, my understanding was, I don't know where it is now, but there was a map that had located some of these trees, these unusual trees. Well, this Don Wells went nationwide for this, and he invited a lot of different nations, Native American nations, to participate in these trail trees. And they don't have to just be trail trees, they could be spear trees, they could be treaty trees. And he's brought all this together in a very finely crafted documentary that will be showing at West Oak High School on the 21st of March from 2 to 4. It's a Saturday, 2 to 4 in the afternoon. And the first time he showed it, he's from Jasper, Georgia. There was over 200 people that took this in, really enjoyed it. And the gentleman that's narrating it is none other than Wes Studi, the actor. I don't know if you ever saw Dance with the Wolves or let's see. He's been in several movies. Last of the Mohicans he was in. He was the bad guy. He was Magwalk in Last of the Mohicans, if you remember him. And he's done a lot of different films. And he's also was kind of a bad guy in Dance with the Wolves. He's the one that shot the wagon master, shot him with cold arrows and did all this stuff. He is hard-boiled eggs and all that kind of stuff. But so I've seen it. Jennifer's seen it. And as a matter of fact, the Oconee Heritage Center is sponsoring it, helping to sponsor it. So I think it's really worthwhile because it tells us an awful lot about past that we have not been aware of very much, and begins to put things back in perspective. And what that leads me into is my work at Clemson University involved in textbooks, and what kids are reading in the textbooks. So I decided to do my dissertation on looking at 15 textbooks that are in the classroom in South Carolina, and where kids are exposed to social studies and history in our public schools is grades 3, 4, 5, 8, and 11. So what I wanted to do is take a look at what they were reading about Native Americans. And I think you can possibly understand it wasn't good. First of all, there was either stuff missing, or it was erroneous, or it was left out altogether. And one of the things that I wanted to attempt to do once I got the dissertation done was to maybe start writing a little bit about the Cherokee and see if we could have some better dialogue in understanding the Cherokee history. And this area being so incredibly part of Cherokee history, I decided there was another lady by the name of Margaret Seaborn who had a predecessor map to this. She made a map in 1974 that located the Cherokee towns in Oconee County. And I wanted to follow up because we had GPS coordinates and all that kind of thing now, and follow up with her really from the beginning so what I did, with the help of some other map experts, because I'm no expert in making them, that's for sure, but we decided to locate the Cherokee towns that were here in the 18th century, and we located, and these are the ones that are documented, that we're fairly sure, very sure that were there, and we had the historical markers to show a lot of these towns. 27 towns just in Oconee County, 27 Cherokee towns. They weren't necessarily there, all of them at the same time, because some of them moved and had the same name for them. If you look on, I gave you a smaller version of the map in your brochure, but that was pretty exciting. So I wanted to find out a lot more about the Cherokee. And part of what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today is, well, we can go back over the map and talk about geography, but that was sort of part one. But I wanted to talk about a couple things. The people that were in these villages and some of the things that they did and what they represented. And at the same time, give you an idea that researching this particular topic is very, very difficult. In part because they didn't leave us many written records. The written records that they have, now people say that Cherokee didn't have writing before Sequoia and when he created the syllabary. But there's a lot of indications, if you know what it was, that says they did have writing, but they're not sharing it. Because if they share it, it's just going to come out all wrong anyway. And there's a lot of things that, and it's probably easy to show, that much of the writing about Native Americans is convoluted nowadays. It means to take a lot of modern ideas and a lot of different groups together. Kind of goes back to the only good Indian is a dead Indian, and all Indians are alike. And nothing could be further from the truth. They had remarkably different customs and social structures, etc. And all of them were very highly sophisticated. Now, but we get these, one of the things I have my students look at is the language that's written in some of the textbooks. And some of the language that comes out about Native Americans is that they're savage, they're primitive, they're pagans, they lived in dark areas, it's always dark. And you notice that they always ambush people. When the soldiers ambush people, it's a good thing. When the natives ambush people, it was a dirty, rotten trick. And that comes out in a lot of our literature over the years. So if we're going to have a useful dialogue, and this stands the test of time, about any minority or any group we don't really understand, we need to begin to understand them. We need to have a lot of good research work to bring them up on the level so we can give them their dues. Because if you look around this area, the first area, the thing that comes to my mind in Oconee County is they're pretty smart people because they settled here. It's one of the most beautiful counties you can possibly have anywhere. It's beautiful here. And who wouldn't want to be here? You get up every morning, look at the mountains. I asked third graders this yesterday, I said, you like to get up and look at the trees? Oh, they love it. How many like to get up and do you see the mountains every morning? Yes, we do. Do you like the mountains? Oh, they love the mountains. So, beautiful place to live. So, what I want to do a little bit today is take a look a little bit at the people and also put into this presentation a little bit some of the difficulty in us in terms of understanding these people. So I'm going to start with, over here, everything about Cherokee history really starts with the clans. The clans were the family. And by the time that there was the first contact with Europeans in the 15th and 16th century, the Cherokee had, as a lot of archaeological data prove, had been reduced to 7 clans, and I've listed them up here: the deer, the wolf, bird, red paint, the blue, the long hair, and the wild shape. And you could say, basically, another way to think about the clans is they were the extended families. And at one time, if you went to any of these 20 plus villages in Oconee County, you could find representatives from every single clan in each one of those families. This was before the first wave of smallpox hit, which was not customary in the New World. It was brought from Europe and wiped out basically half the population right away. 1695 was the first wave. There's 3 waves of epidemic smallpox. First was 1695. You had another one in 1738, and they had another one in the early 1760s. So it was a scourge for Native Americans because they had no immunity to it, never seen it before. By the end of the century, they lost about 95% of the population. So Francis Vernade was a traveling evangelist, and he decided, a remarkable piece of work. I also have some of his work in the back of the booklet that I've done. And he went to every single town he could find and listed the men, women, and children in the villages. And at one time, there was about over 10,000 people just in the lower towns. And they had all been reduced by 1721 good bit. So you can see it was a pretty healthy population. And why wouldn't it be? Even today, look at the natural resources we have in this area. And that's one of the first things that the Cherokee did, was they looked for the resources that could sustain life. Some of these towns had populations of up to 500 people. And that would match anything most European towns had at the time, if you look at the same time period. So pretty remarkable. So it all starts with these clans, these families, these extended families. And then, so what I thought I'd do, let's see how this works out. There we go. The people of the town, let's talk about the people. The first people I want to talk about, and it is a group of people known as the Attaway. And the best that I can explain to you, we use the word priest, but the word priest doesn't really fit with them very well. And the reason I say it doesn't fit very well is because oftentimes in Western thought, Western writers, we create models of how everything should be. Our anthropologists say, okay, according to ours, this should be the culture, this should be the social structure, this should be the politics, and everything fits in a model. But when you're dealing with certain groups, sometimes it's like putting a square peg into a round hole. It just doesn't fit right. It just doesn't seem right. So the priests were not really what we understand as religious men. And another thing I might say about Cherokee society, there was no pyramid of power in this. You wouldn't have a priestly class that was at the top over everybody else. This was a completely linear society. It was what we would understand for well over 100 years before the Europeans came. Was a purely democratic society. There was no upper class, there was no lower class, and that's why, and they didn't compete for goods and services. They were certainly worked with each other. Everybody had a role to play. Every single one of these clans had a specific role in Cherokee society to fulfill that was different from the other groups, and it made sense because you want everybody doing the same thing. Everybody went hunting, and somebody was probably going to starve to death because there'd be no agriculture. And we'll come to the women's role in a minute. I didn't realize this was going to roll out here. So the Attaway were the spiritual leaders, and they believed that they were descendants of the great creator. And they were, and you had a couple different types of the Attaway priests. And sometimes the English, I'll come back to this in a minute, the English would call them chiefs. Now I'm not even really sure when Cherokee leaders were called chiefs. Now the Europeans may have called people chiefs in other European encounters, maybe the Irish and some other groups. But as I look through the original documentation that came out from 1759, maybe a little bit earlier at times, they didn't refer to them as chiefs. So that's another Western word. Of course, it means a leader, and oftentimes you think about a chief as he has coercive power. But what I mean by coercive power, he's able to tell people what to do, go to war, not to go to war. The Attaway, he didn't have coercive power. They were there because they wanted to serve the people. They took no pay for it. And even when people would bring them gifts, they'd return the gifts to other people in a very communal way. So they really shared together in the good and bad of the society. So there were two types of Attaway. There were the peace Attaway, and these were the ones that conducted the ceremonies, and they dealt with domestic issues. And I don't know if any of you have ever studied the ceremonies, but they are incredibly elaborate. I read one ceremony, I think it was the New Moon ceremony, and it covered 54 pages. And these ceremonies lasted an entire week, 7 days. And 7 you will find is a very spiritual number to Cherokee, as it is in a lot of faiths and et cetera. We had 7 days in the beach, et cetera, et cetera. But everything was 7 with them. So these festivals always lasted 7 to honor the Creator. They go to the river, and every morning together as a town, and they would dunk themselves in the river and thank the Creator, and they dunk themselves 7 times, dip themselves 7 times in the river to thank the Creator for another great day and the beauty that He gave them. So it was these folks who conducted the ceremonies, and these ceremonies were very elaborate, involved everybody in the village, and they were exhausting to read about. Some things they had to pay attention to. So the idea is that they just, here's a good chunk of land, let's just go settle on it. They kicked off. No, these people planned well, and this had been going on for centuries with them. Okay. Now then you had another Attaway, and he was the peace Attaway, he would also be known as the white Attaway, peace. He could not be involved in warfare. He could not conduct the ceremonies if he took human life. So he just had to, in order to conduct the ceremony. The only time he would even fight is if he had to really defend himself, and that way he just tried to keep the person off him until something else could help. Not that he couldn't fight, but it was, and their understanding that peace Attaway warfare. But you did have another Attaway who was the head of warfare, and he was called the war chief, as we understand the chief. I'll use that kind of word interchangeably because it's easy to say. But he was the head of the warfare, but he also was involved in negotiations, alliances, and trade. Can you imagine? And you think about this, and I've heard some people say, man, they must have had it really made back then and have to work all the time. This is pretty hard work, because they got to have advanced warriors out all the time, looking at the territory, making sure everything was safe. And as long as there's other Cherokee, all these towns that are talked about, this was all Cherokee territory. There wasn't nobody else here. So when you read online that there was this tribe and that tribe, no, it's not like call them tribes, it just sounds like pejorative. But these people were the only ones that were here in this area, for thousands of years as a group. By the way, just a side note, they didn't like to settle next to big water, like the oceans. You never find Cherokee villages near the water. You know why? Because only bad things come out of the ocean. Think about it for a second. Pretty true, right? Not just tsunamis in water form, but also tsunamis in the shape of European ships and people. So they never, you wouldn't find a lot of their towns established. Rivers, yes, but not everything else. The priests, also this group of Attaway, came from the birth point, one of the clans up here. And the four families that were in the Attaway were known as the Raven, Eagle, Hawk, and Thunderbird. Nobody else could take those names in Cherokee, among the Cherokee. That was reserved just for these groups. Most of the stuff that I read about up through, say, 1700 to 1750, when the Attaway began to lose a lot of authority, power, leadership role in Cherokee society, called from the Raven group. And you would say that there was a lot of correspondence between commanders at Fort Prince George to other commanders or to the governor. And they would say the Raven of Toxaway or the Raven of Eastern Poet came and spoke to us today. You know, and this is another thing. Some writers say the Raven such and such. This guy's name was Raven. It wasn't a name. It was a title. But I'll come back to that too. It gets kind of confusing because we'll never know probably the name. Once in a while. This was also the only group that had patrilineal descent. That means descent like we would understand it through the father's side. So their sons would take on the role of a priest, and they would carry on the father's line. Everything else was through the woman's side. When a woman and a man got married, they would descend through the woman's clan. Couldn't marry in the same clan. That's one thing people have asked me about a long time. A Deer Clan person cannot marry another member of Deer Clan. She can marry any one of the other six. But you know, the idea of the incest and all that kind of thing, kept that away, so relatives, etc. It's really cool because I'm kind of putting this off. Well, I'll tell now. When a woman wanted a divorce, she'd initiate the divorce. She'd set all those personal belongings outside of her house and say, "Get out, Buster. You have to go home to the grades." So, and the kids would be related to her, not to the father. She would be related to her. Okay? Now, when the English first came over, one of the frustrating things that happened was when they went into these villages, they wanted to find out who the leader of the village was so they could negotiate an alliance or a treaty with them and get on good ground with them. So they might come into this and they would say, well, who's your head man? Who's your leader? Well, goodness gracious, they had a lot of leaders, and we'll come back to that in just a second. But in the writings, they began to call them kings. They would talk, this could be an Attaway, he could be some other guy who call this too. But oftentimes they would associate the Attaway with being the king. There were a lot of rituals involved in what the Attaway did, so that's maybe why they call him king. They also wanted to have somebody be an emperor, and they actually had this guy named Moitoy become emperor of all the Cherokee. He lived in the Overhills town, but they wanted him to be the emperor of all the Cherokee. So what the English decided in a treaty, etc., with Moitoy would stand with all the Cherokee. So the Cherokee said, okay, go ahead and make that agreement and make Moitoy emperor, but I'm going to tell you right now, we're not going to do anything about it because we don't agree. He can decide anything he wants. He can decide some trade agreements, but that's about it. He's not going to tell us what to do. These, not only were they democratic Cherokee towns, but they were also ferociously autonomous. They didn't want anything to do with any other towns in terms of agreement. They didn't have to agree with anything else. And the English, it drove the English nuts. It was how they're going to get territory, how they're going to get trade agreements if not everybody agrees. And there's one in particular they called King Crow. This was a guy, I love his name, one of the first guys who was appointed by the government of Charleston to be the superintendent of Indian Affairs of the southern part. It was a guy from Scotland. His name was George Chicken. Yes, Chicken. And one of the reasons that George Chicken and other guys from Scotland worked pretty well, because the Scottish also had clans. So they thought if they were in clans, they could deal with other groups that were in clans, like the Cherokee. It wasn't a bad call, because they did get along with it pretty well. But he came upon this guy in Tugelo town. Now, Tugelo, if you look at your map, it's on the Tugelo River, one of the most famous towns in early Cherokee history. And when he went in there, he was introduced to this leader. And we called him, he was called Cherokee. That's what the name was given. I don't never know exactly what his real Cherokee name was. They called him Cherokee Hagee. And he called him, he began to call him King Crow. King Crow. Everywhere he went, he met him in some other towns. I said, why did he call him King Crow? First of all, I wasn't a king. But why Crow? Then I began to realize Crow, the idea of Crow and Raven, if you think of the interchange of translation and all that, there's a pretty good bet that he was referring to Raven and not Crow. And the Cherokee word for Raven is Colonel. And this, and by the way, if you do kind of an exchange here, L's are usually in the dialect of the middle settlements, and R's are in the dialect of our area, the lower towns. So he was also called Coronet. Oh, this is fun to go through, because it's spelled so many different ways. It must be 10 different spellings of a lot of these words. So you scratch your head and say, okay, what's he trying to say here? So what probably George Chicken was confusing, he wasn't King Crow, he was the Raven, so he was Mattaway. But he called him a king. He wasn't a priest. He was one of the peace chiefs of that time. Okay? So I mentioned already that one way was made number of that too. Yes, he called him King Crow. Okay, now the second one, this is but the second person that was a significant Cherokee town, and I'm not necessarily going down, I'm going across, was what we call the medicine man. And Dina Waskawi is kind of how you pronounce it in Cherokee. Dina Waskawi. And what kind of bothered me a little bit about this is they were healers and advisors. They were true medicine men, because they didn't have doctors to go to. So these guys had to have a lot of knowledge about plants, herbs, etc. back then in order to heal people. So, but they come down, as I mentioned here, but the English came in and they began to call them conjurers and shamans. Well, a conjurer and a shaman is something entirely different than a healer. So just as a dictionary definition, I looked this stuff up. And this carried on. This carried on into James Mooney was another writer who lived among the Cherokee at the very early stages of the late 19th, early 20th century. And he referred to them as savage. He called their medicine men conjurers and shamans, and they weren't. So I looked up dictionary definitions. Conjurer is basically defined as a wizard or magician who practices sleight of hand, which means they trick you into believing something. Okay? Kind of like a doctor might give you sugar pills instead of real stuff. They really don't. And a shaman, pretty much the same thing. A priest who uses magic. My argument is he was neither of those two things. He was a true healer, according to a lot of the Cherokee stuff that I've looked at, and he has great knowledge of the herbs and natural remedies of the area. So he was a genuine person. It's kind of funny that if you see these old westerns, that if there's an eclipse coming, it's funny how white guys know about the eclipse coming, and the Indians never know anything about it. This is all these people did was study the stars. And if you watch any of this stuff on archaeology and TV, these people knew the position of the stars. They had these massive rocks and petroglyphs. They indicated the movement of the stars and all that stuff. But they didn't know anything about, apparently about the eclipses. So they would trick the Indians into believing that, oh, it's great magic. And that's all Hollywood. It's unfortunate. But that's what we grew up with. And that's what you kind of have to dispel a little bit. Probably one of the first movies that really put Native Americans in some sort of perspective was Dances with Wolves. Kevin Costner is probably one of his best achievements, because he wrote about as John Dunbar, this soldier that goes out there, and if you listen to it a little bit, he talks about his journal writings, and he says everything we're learning about these people is not true, and the way they treat each other and the family is remarkable, remarkable thing. And if you get a chance, read the book. It's even better than the movie. And he comes out, and he's actually dealing with the Comanches. You get kind of the idea of the movie they're either Sioux or Cheyenne, but actually the book calls them Comanches. And when John Dunbar first sees this, comes out on his plane and he sees the village, and now the Comanche loved horses. They were great horse stealers and considered the best horsemen ever to set foot in America. And you get this from Jeremiah Johnson, Miller, talk about how good some of the Indians are at horses. And they said he came out and there was, some people pronounce it Remuda and some Remuda, and they said there's sometimes over 1,000 horses. So it's just a massive, fantastic sight to see. And the villages and how well the villages were designed and set up. Another good indication of how villages might have been set up. You ever seen Pocahontas, the animated version? Ever seen it? No, nobody seen it? It's really neat because they show an Indian village planting and doing that and working together in the fields. And Russell Means, who was also in Last of the Mohicans, who's the big barrel-chested guy with that great big war club that clowning people with. But he's I think he was Sioux or Chippewa, and he made a comment about that. He said that scene of Pocahontas is probably one of the best representations of Native Americans he'd ever seen in it. So there's a lot of different interpretations of it. So they were really interesting. All right. Yeah. So you've got two head persons. You've got the Oconee and you've got the medicine men. Okay. The next people we might take a look at is other people could be misunderstood or misunderstood as head men or head women. So if I was an English leader and I said I'd like to speak to your head person, they'd say, okay, you got your choice. And they keep going down the line, which one do you want to see? Well, among the men were the clan leaders. So each one of the clans had a clan leader. They also had 7 men on the council. They had 7 men from the clan councils. They had 7 men to advise the Oconee. So what you want to see one of those? All right. They had the elders, and once upon a time, folks, elders were given their due for being wiser than the young kids. I think that's kind of turned around these days. Wouldn't you agree? Sadly, boy, I wish they listened to me when I tell them something, but they don't. So the elders, of course, and by elders, a lot of people live pretty long lives and something, some natural disaster didn't happen. They claim that one of the things I heard of the Cherokee was bringing in domesticated animals from Europe. They said they were unclean, and they wouldn't touch pork. Pork was unclean because hogs and pigs are bottom feeders. They're not talking about modern society, they're talking about then. And they wouldn't eat any domesticated stuff. So the elders could give them all that wisdom. There's another person in Cherokee society who's known as the beloved man, and Agata Bugani. And this is really hits home with me because this title hasn't been bestowed on anyone in Cherokee society since 1801, except until a year or two ago, when Jerry Wolf, a lot of you might be familiar with Jerry Wolf from the Eastern Band, was given that designation of Agata Bugani. A beloved man is somebody who does something very, very special for the people. And if you know anything about Jerry, he's all over the East Coast making presentations and doing just wonderful work for everybody who asks him. And I think that's it. He has his policy to probably never turn anything down. So it's really, really amazing that kind of guy. We asked him if he made some stickball sticks for us. And he still makes all the traditional stickball sticks out of hickory. And heat them and bend them and all this kind of thing. And puts the net material in it. I think it's probably nylon now. And he also loved to announce the stickball games for years and years. And so he's a big stickball. Asked him if you go to the north, along the Iroquois, they also still play with the old hickory cross sticks. The stickball sticks you play with two sticks. Well, for a little while you play with. You throw the ball up in the air. The referee throws the ball up and you have to grab 2 sticks with the sound of the ground or in the air. But once you get done grabbing the 2 sticks, you bring the ball and put it in your chest, and then guess what you do? You run like your life depended on it toward the goal. And your life did depend on it a lot of times because what you do is people are going to tackle you, get the ball, they're going to hit you with those hickory sticks. And if you ask the lacrosse national team when they had to play against the Native American team, the Iroquois. The Iroquois actually beat the American national team in hockey or in lacrosse last year, and they were talking to one of the players from the American team how to go. He says those guys are rough, and those hickory sticks really hurt because they like to use it beat down a little bit with it. So, and by the way, we might as well get women into this point about stickball. In 1850, it was banned for women to play stickball among the Cherokee. They had played it before that. You know why they banned it for women? Women were too rough. Think about that. So you don't want to get a Cherokee woman upset. So in the year 2000, bringing Cherokee back out of the mountain, 150 years after it was banned, they asked Jerry Wolf if he thought that he could go to the Cherokee Council and ask if women could play stickball game. He says, yeah, I think it's time. With 150 years it was to happen. So they allowed it. So he said he was up in the booth and he was announcing the game. He looked down and threw the ball up to start the game. And he said, this one woman jumped so high, I swore she'd better hang time to Michael Jordan. And he said, then he realized she wasn't hanging up there. She was being held up there by another woman from the other team who grabbed her around the waist. And that woman proceeded to slam her on the ground. And the fight was on. So after the game was over, guess what the Cherokee Council did? Banned women from playing. Now, I also want to talk about head women as well, because this was an equitable society. There was no, everybody had their dealings with how they were going to work in the society. And, you know, some people want to say, well, women work harder, men work harder. It doesn't matter. I don't want to get into this quantitative measurement of trying to guess who works harder. Maybe that would be a good guess, but they certainly were some head women at that time. Well, back then, there was a town that supposedly the Spanish came through called Chiqua, and the Cherokee. A lot of people don't know where they came from. They think it was a Mississippian town, and I've got some information from some of the Cherokee people that said no, it was actually a Cherokee town, and there was a woman that was the quote-unquote chief or the head person. And I don't know whether she probably was. She could have even been Anna White, depending on the line of descent at the time. But in modern times, we've actually had two women who were the head of Cherokee. One was Joyce Dugan, and in the 1990s, she was the principal chief of the Eastern Band of Cherokee. Wilma Mankiller was the principal chief in the 1990s of the Western Band of Cherokee. Wilma Mankiller in particular made a lot of good history for the Cherokee, putting in sewer systems and lighting and all that. Just a remarkable woman. She passed away about 3 or 4 years ago from cancer. They could also be clan leaders. They could be elders, and they could be beloved women. They called them gigaboots. That was their equivalent to Agadoudani. Probably the most famous of those came into this area at the Treaty of Hopewell, which is now at near Clemson University. That's where they did the treaty. In 1785, there was a treaty between the newly formed United States and 3 Native American nations. One of those was the Cherokee Nation. So she got an opportunity to speak for the Cherokee people. And what made her a gigaboo, like I said, you had to do something very, very special for the people. So what did she do so special? Well, in order to be a gigaboo, most of the time, you also had to be an elder. You had to live a long time to do something special. So oftentimes, you were probably in your 50s and beyond that to be given this title of gigaboo. Like Jerry Wolf was in his 90s to be a Agadoudani. Well, the story about Nancy Ward is that if you look at the map along this area, we're connected here with Georgia, and the Creeks lived in northern Georgia and Alabama, and they were always vying for territory with the Cherokee. So they would have some invasion. I'll tell you a little bit about warfare if we have a little bit of time, but it wasn't the warfare we think. It wasn't to wipe out, just take out a few and maybe camp coup, a few things like that, but show that you didn't mess around with the territory. And finally, they decided that in 1755, they needed to put an end to these Creek raids, because what happened, towns like Kilo, Chaga, and Eastatoy, and many of the others were in this little cluster here, had to abandon their towns and get up into this area over here. And as you notice on your map, there's an Eastatoy over here, there's an Eastatoy and Pickens County. And there's a taxiway down here, and there's a taxiway in Oconee County. So they just moved their stuff and named the town the same, which if you're historian, it's really confusing. Because you try to figure out, okay, which is what they're talking about, and you have to go by dates, because when they talk about East Hill here, it's specifically after, say, the 1750. It's kind of weird. And that's still above ground, by the way. There's a lot of them that as a result of flooding from the lakes. Many of these towns along the rivers are under the water, which is both a mixed blessing and a curse. You can't find out enough about it, but nobody gets to touch the stuff. So it's safer even there, even though it's still a sign of that. But in 1755, there's a place in northern Georgia called Talbot. It's near Dahlonega, Georgia, by the way, which is the word for gold in Cherokee, Dahlonega, gold or yellow. And the Cherokee confronted the Creeks there, big battle. Nancy Ward was married to this guy named Kingfisher. Kingfisher was shot to death in battle. And so she was there, she was a war woman at the time. Women could go with their spouses and with the army, and sometimes they'd do the cooking, take care of the tenant, but they could also shoot bullets and load weapons at the same time. So apparently Nancy Ward got so incensed about her husband being shot, she took up the rifle and charged the Creeks. Well, no self-respecting Cherokee man is going to let a woman from their tribe be the only one that's going to charge the Creeks, so they got up and charged too, and they overcame the Creeks and won the battle. And because of her bravery and what she did, she was given the title of Gigaboo, and she was 17 years old when she did that. So that's very, very young for somebody. I think it's the youngest they ever had recorded that for sure. So from that time on, she would go into war councils. She could help with negotiations. She could go up to the warriors and say, "You guys are crazy. We're not going to war today. We're not going to go to battle. You just stay home." When they wanted to burn, they actually were going to burn a woman at the stake, and she went and saved a woman, and she assaulted the Cherokee warriors for picking on women, and so she could get away with a lot of stuff because she was a gigaboo. So she was very instrumental, and she was like many other Native American and American women at the same time, and saying, "Remember the women, because we know you don't treat us like equals in this society, but we are the ones that are your mothers. So you better remember that." And so she was very beloved for that. And so she made some important speeches in the history class. Okay. Now, a couple others to go to and kind of open it up a little bit. Or do you have any questions now before I move on? Said a lot of stuff. Anything that might have left out or anything you're curious about? That food is settling in. Okay. Just two other groups I kind of want to talk about a little bit were the warriors, because again, the warriors caused me some problems as to who actually these warriors were and who was called a warrior. And Cherokee, in the older time, a lot of these words have changed. A lot of them have gone out of favor and replaced by another word. But Skiagoonsta was another term for warrior. That meant warrior. So as I was reading some of this stuff, even in modern history trade books that you get from libraries and bookstores and et cetera, there was one, Rosalind, her name is, good writer, but she kept saying Skiagoonsta of Kiwi, then she said Skiagoonsta of Tatsway, and Skiagoonsta, and I said, no, wait a minute. This is just kind of a monotonous way to name your children all the same thing. But then you realize it wasn't. It was a title. So again, but they make no notation that it's actually a title and not actually the person's name. And that's kind of the bone I have to pick with them, is that at least let your audience know that you talk about somebody who has the title of the person. And so, but it made sense in the 1750s. You see a lot of those referred to in the lower towns, from Fort Prince George, and communications back and forth, Skiagoonsta of Kiwi or Oconee Town, whatever the case might be. And so, as I said, they often mistook the name, and it was actually the title. And you had to earn the status of warrior. You didn't actually have to kill someone to be a warrior. You just had to do the training to be a warrior. And guys often did this from a very early age. By the way, when the children began to grow up, for a little bit later on, they weren't raised by their moms and dads. They were raised by their maternal aunts and uncles. Remember, this is a maternal society, maternal society. So their aunts would raise the girls, their maternal uncles would raise the boys to learn these things. So to learn what it took to be a warrior, to learn what it took to be an agriculturalist and a homemaker for that word, homemaker. So Sky Moonsta is a really interesting word for it, and there's a different word for him. Now, one for this is another crazy one. This is spelled all different ways, half a dozen different ways. So you really talk about the same person. And there's another term for man killer, and probably have it here. Yeah. Man killer is with a cite, and you could see a tacite and spelled at least that number of ways. I just looked up real quickly some of the spellings I had. Say assemble those all together and say, did they talk about these folks in the lower towns? And they did. Wilma Mankiller, look at her last name, Mankiller. So in her autobiography, she goes in a little bit of detail about that name and said that was a title at one time of somebody who was indeed got the distinction of having killed more than somebody wanted. So that's how I got that title. It has another meaning to it, but it's not for this particular time. Okay. So that gives you some of the ideas about how to go about a little bit about research and kind of the challenges. I don't call them problems, but they're challenges to the historian. And that doesn't mean we have it right. Completely right. There's all sorts of interpretations. But the thing with research, and I'm trying to get a full-length book finished on the lower towns, and try to keep it as germane as I can to the lower towns. But some of the information is missing. So sometimes what you have to do is you have to extrapolate the information from the other towns. Some of the towns that were more intact for a later period of time. And particularly if you go to the over those towns, there's a lot of information that comes out of those towns, and the people were there a lot longer. Most of these towns were destroyed during the Revolutionary War in the lower towns that are on this map. They were gone as a result of that conflict. And Williamson, Colonel Williamson, who was promoted a little bit later on, he was the one that headed some of the armies in this area that took out almost every single one of the lower towns. And the testimonials and things that come out of those, it's really interesting and almost ironic that a lot of the information that we get about the lower towns comes from the soldiers marching through those towns. One of the things we find out about is the prosperity of those towns. These towns were incredibly prosperous. You kind of think how they had the organization of all these people, et cetera, everybody doing a different task. A lot of stuff to get done, and they sure did. Williamson marched through, and I don't know if you know much about, we all basically come from farming communities, except particularly from around here. And a bushel basket, how much that would be. Well, when Williams and his troops marched through a Seneca town, which is located near Clemson University site, and they destroyed all the corn that was stored there, and Williamson estimated 5,000 bushels of corn was destroyed. 5,000 bushels of corn. Then if you travel through all the other towns, they talk about cutting down orchards. They had peach orchards, they had apple orchards, and they semi-domesticated the forest and those kinds of things. So, and it's this group of people who kind of spearheaded this and got all this organization in it. William Bartram, another writer, and we've got historical markers up near Duke Energy. You see it on the left-hand side, sometimes it's covered up with weeds, this time you can see it. But he was talking with somebody at a Seneca village. He came through in about 1775, and they said if you went from Seneca Village all the way up, of course this is when the lakes came in, but pre-impoundment, all the way up to Kiwu Town and beyond Sugar Town, called Sugar Town, about 17, 18 miles worth of distance. He said, the old timers used to say, there was nothing but cornfields all the way up through here, that 17 or 18 miles. He said even the hillsides were planted with corn. So, and then the Europeans there came in and said, they weren't good farmers. You've got to be freaking kidding me. And thousands of bushels of corn put in storage. And they stored some of it so they could trade it at times, they could feed the poor, and they always fed strangers when they came in. And they gave you basically, if you were a stranger, they treated you as well as they treated one in Rome until you gave them a reason not to. Then you better learn to run very fast. They didn't like you after about 3 days, they could tell that you weren't a good person. You better have your Nikes on. Anything else at this point? Any more about trail trees or some things?
But the towns, a lot of the towns like this story I heard, Mint Valley of Greenberg, the towns have significant meaning?
Most of what I found is towns were usually named after something that was natural, like actually Sugartown was a European name. The Cherokee referred to it as Honey Locust Place. So the idea of something natural in the air. Kiwi is placed in the mulberry. The Seneca town, they think was named after Seneca, or Seneca was named after it. They really don't have that much of a connection. It's something to the effect of water running backwards. So whether it was the confluence of two streams at one time, they gave them that impression. So oftentimes now, you're right, East Etoy, they suggested it was Valley, the green bird, but the two words in Cherokee that will cover that, Chisqua is bird, and Iche is green. So that doesn't sound anything like East Etoy. So, but people do that all the time. I mean, it's okay. They just kind of assume that. No, it's, some of them we simply don't know. And actually, at one time, there was 4 East Etoys to drive me nuts. And one of them was just outside of Dillard, Georgia. So when I went to the eastern, spoke with Barbara Duncan up at the Cherokee Qual boundary. We call it a Qual boundary, by the way, because that land was actually purchased by the Cherokee. A reservation is land set aside by the U.S. government for them. The Cherokee didn't want land set aside by the government. They wanted to buy their own land, so the Qual boundary is actually they own all that. But when I went up to talk to her one day, I said, you know where this East Etoy is? That's your Dillard, Georgia sisters. I know exactly what it is. And the only way that you could see it is because you could see the mound that's still there. And so I went right exactly her directions and went on this dirt road looking out the field, and there was the mound. So I knew right where East Etoy was. But I knew then that it was obviously in the middle, over the middle settlements really there, instead of Oconee County in our settlements. Because sometimes when you're walking with Bartram up through the Bartram Trail and stuff to get to the overhills, it gets a little confusing as to exactly where he is at times. And sometimes they do that. But I'm not really concerned that much with geographic boundaries, but when you're doing maps and you get grants from the county, then you gotta make sure you kind of straight what you get in the county stuff. I just kind of sneaked in a little bit of the stuff surrounding it, so it gives some perspective. But I couldn't get, on the map, I could not get enough of the towns in Georgia to get to the Chattahoochee River. I just didn't have it, get it wide enough. But there were 3 or 4 towns along the Chattahoochee River too, which I also put in a little piece of the booklet. The booklet actually covers anything, any of the towns that are on the maps. And if you want to take a look at the booklets too, on the cover, I had a guy do this artwork. That's what a Cherokee village probably looked like in the old days. Pre-contact and even after contact a little bit. And the Europeans were very good describers of what they saw. Excellent descriptions. We got one that describes an Attaway going into a position of leadership, the eagle's tails, the pomp, the ceremony of it that lasted for hours and hours. So you just can't say, oh, we're going to hug you, we're going to make you chief. These people knew what they were doing for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's passed down through generations. Their storytelling is very famous. Yeah.
Any idea why they had that practice of the aunts and uncles raising the kids instead of the parents?
One of the reasons I can think of actually happened in colonial times among colonists. I used to get people to come into my lectures at Clemson and other universities doing this. I said, we're going to talk about putting out at the next lecture. They said, oh, okay, this is going to be an interesting lecture. But there was a system called the putting out system where the parents would take their kids and put them in a trade, put them out into a trade when they turned teenagers. And they did that because they were teenagers. You get my point?
Yeah.
Who has control of teenagers? They don't even have control of themselves. So I think that was part of it, is that it's easier for, quote unquote, somebody more distant from the parents themselves to be able to teach the kids.
It would be an emotional
Yeah.
aspect.
So, yeah. So they were disappointed that way about that. So, yeah.
Are there any places around these, on your map that have anything left to show that Indians have been there?
Not a heck of a lot.
Stuff like that, burial mounds, stuff
Yeah.
like that, yeah, so.
There are some towns that still have some mounds, and we have located probably close to a dozen historical markers close to some of the sites in these towns. One of the problems is many of them are on private land, and second is because of the continual farming. They kept plowing around these mounds, and now the mounds are flat. And actually, these mounds, in this particular case, were not burial mounds. What they were directed to do early on, according to some of the legends of the Great Creator, they want to have these mounds, and a council house was built on top of the mounds. council house was this massive roundhouse that would include all the people in it, get everybody in it, and there were rafters in it, and each one of the clans would come in order and sit in each one of those 7 sections. And they were deep enough so that little children could slide to the back and fall asleep. And that's where they did all their political talking, all their social talking, that sort of thing. And so if there was a big issue that came up, everybody came because it was a democratic democracy. And they would have to decide on it. So, and guess who got the last word to go to warfare? Women got the last word. And more ways than one. And the women's council said, no, you're not going to war, then they couldn't. Number one. Number two, you're probably going to go half naked because they made the clothes. And second, you wouldn't have any food because they provide you with food. So you're on your own if you want to go out there and get killed. Okay, else. What do you think kids did back then?
Hunt, fish, farm.
Yeah, it kind of is. They began to learn the skills that would put them into adulthood, and in some ways not a lot different than what our kids do today, because we give them an education, hope that they learn something and grow up and get a career, and so we develop them in certain ways. Yeah. How about the elders? There's some other groups here that.
So,
Yeah, depends on who they were. They were kind of the sources of advice. You always turned to your elders. You didn't disrespect the elder. The Attaway also had a special position for this too. You never talk back to the Attaway. In some cases, you could be put to death for it. That's what they used to say. I don't know if it was ever that severe. They also, this is a really interesting feature of Cherokee society too. Like I mentioned, they were good to people that came in. They had Choda, which was in the Overhills area, was a peace town. And that meant that they had this ceremony once a year that all your bad things were forgiven. So if you took a life, you'd be forgiven for that during that ceremony. And you could come out clean and everybody would leave you alone. So, but as smallpox ate into these folks and they had a whole new concept of warfare, then the population of the town went down. I think Vernad estimated altogether was in 1721 was about 32,000 Cherokee. The divisions were the lower towns here, and then you had the middle settlement and the valley settlement in Georgia, and North Carolina. And then you had the Overhills town in Tennessee. And so you had the four distinctive areas of that. And as smallpox hit those. At one time, they actually occupied 8 states. And then it continued to be reduced, obviously, over time through treaties and warfare, etc. Any more about the trail trees? Anybody pick up on any of the trail trees at all and see some of these on your property? Somebody came in the other day, just told me about one. I just wanted to call your attention a little bit to the brochure then, because there's a trail tree on there. You go out here, of course, you get to take a look at the dugout. Was it 32 feet? And it's not complete, and it's not a full thing, so it's broken up, but we still got a 32-foot dugout out there, which we're pretty sure it's not necessarily Cherokee, but obviously they got the idea. It's a continuation. I asked the kids yesterday, think about the importance of trees and what it provides for us. And don't take trees for granted, or you'll be out of breath. And then the chunky stones that are down here, which is game that they played, we found those at Pumpkin Town, at the archaeological site we have, and it's right on the Pickens, Greenville County border. It's a farm there called the Robertson Farm, and there's actually 2 sites. And the first site, got a real quick story about that too. The Robertson site, when he invited the archaeologists to come up, now Mr. Robertson's a farmer, great land for farming. It's on the confluence of the Schlüter River and Illinois. And so he was plowing one time and kept finding these artifacts, and he's got some chunky stones that are huge, just a massive collection. He kept them all in his trunk. So every time he was driving around, his car was kind of tilted up. He found so much. I said, aren't you going to put those somewhere else? And he said, that's someday. But real great guy. And then his brother and sister-in-law own land right across the river. Another great site. So they started doing that. But to get back to what, and that's where we're digging now. That's where these chunky stones were found, was on the sister-in-law's land. And this was a game that they played, and I'll get into that in no time. We'll talk a little bit about games. But a funny story, when the archaeologists came up, they wanted to look at a particular place for it. He says, no, this is where I found most of the stuff is over here. And they said, well, we want to dig over here. So he puts his hands on his hips and said, you realize whose land you're on? So they decided to dig where he said, and they came right across the village site in no time at all. They didn't have to, they went down below the plow line and began finding, the structure of villages, post holes, all sorts of things. The one they're doing on the other side, they think might have been palisaded. They're not sure. We did find some post holes, which I think were part of palisades. And you can't see it on this, but on this booklet in front of it, they overlapped their palisade that went around the village to protect it. And you know why they overlapped it like that? Have any idea? Entrance and exit, you know why they did that? Because if the enemy tried to attack, they'd have to come in one at a time. So they had their bowmen up on the sides and come in one at a time, they'd pick you off one at a time. So very difficult. So they were pretty sharp. And also, a palisaded village can also mean that your territory isn't real safe, if you have to protect yourself from palisade. So a lot of them were on the borders, but you might not find the villages and towns on the interior palisaded, because they were safe for the people on the border. The Wolf clan was a significant clan because they were the warriors. And like I say, every single, we could go through those and go on in detail about those for a long time, but the Wolf clan in particular, they actually watched wolves and how they operated, and how they worked as a team, and et cetera. And they designed their war practices after the movements of the wolf. And so that's why they were very good at warfare. They weren't the only warriors, but they were the clan that had that was occupied with warfare more than any other clan. They had 3 peace clans, 3 war clans, and 1 neutral clan at that time. Your clan was one of the clans that was a peace clan. I can't remember some of the others. Anything else? Well, you're welcome to come up and look at maps. You can look at books. I got the booklets. I got those for sale, and the maps for sale if you so desire to look at those. And next time, I hope to get into a little bit more about families and continue on with this sort of, it's become a series now, I guess, and how the families operated and marriage and those kinds of things, social considerations. Right. You've been a great audience. Thank you so much.